Hello, everybody, and welcome to this joint event between Demos and Legal & General, talking about people's aspirations for the places in which they live and work. It's just going to take a few moments for everybody to tick through on the webinar link, so I won't pass over to our panelists, but I'll just say a very quick word about them. So Kitty Ussher, former Treasury Minister, has been the lead researcher on this project. She's the Chief Economic Advisor at Demos. Delighted to be joined by Robert Jenrick, the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, Tara Alice, who is the Head of Research at McKinsey, and Dr. Nigel Wilson, the Group Chief Executive of Legal & General, who made this research possible. I think it's incredibly relevant and important as the government talks about levelling up, and we all think about building back better, building back stronger, trying to build up resilience and deal with political, economic and social inequalities across our country, that we think about and engage with, as we always do at Demos, what is it that people actually want from their politics and from their economics? We always engage with the public in almost all of the policy work that we do. And that's what we've been able to do here, thanks to the support from Legal & General, is really explore constituency by constituency. What is it that people want from their economic and social lives and from the places that they live and work? I'm going to ask Kitty to give us a quick run through of the main findings. You can also have a look after the event at our website where you can explore your own area. Thanks, Kitty.
Thanks very much, Polly. Great to be here. I'm just going to kick off, perhaps provide some context by racing through our main results from this Places project at Demos, and hopefully that'll provide the context for the conversation, which I'm very much looking forward to. So the aims of the project were to explore how the pandemic has affected our own relationship with the place, our local area that we call home, and also to track how places perform against the stated priorities, not of some expert group or Whitehall, but of people's subjective own priorities for their area. And finally, as you'd expect from a think tank, to provide data and recommendations for leaders, both in policy and also in the private sector, with a particular focus on the levelling up debate. So just very quickly, what did we do? We conducted a very large poll, 20,000 people, great to be able to do that, which meant that we could provide fairly decent constituency results using the technique of MRP. We spoke to people qualitatively with 4 focus groups, 2 in towns in the north of England, 2 in the south. We held 3 expert roundtable events in January. Thank you to everyone on this call who took part in that, which led to 2 final reports available on our microsite. And one of the key outputs was the construction of what we're calling a place satisfaction index. Now, this gets a bit techie and the full details are in the reports, but the key element that I would draw out is that we are measuring the gap between what people say is important to them personally to have locally and how they view the provision of those items. So an index score of plus 100 would represent somebody who thinks their local area does a very good job in providing all the things that they themselves think are important. And an index score of minus 100 is the converse of that. So somebody who thinks that their local area does a very bad job of all the things that they think are important. And the items that we tested, and we forced choices between them to get a nice priority, we had 35 items, and they are deliberately a sort of everyday prosaic kind of list of the things that we use in everyday lives, whether it's from supermarkets, restaurants and bars, places to take exercise, premises for jobs, different types of housing, the look and feel of the community, and so on. It's worth saying that health and education we decided after some debate to exclude, because we felt that in our culture at the moment there is a strong sense that this should be uniformly provided in a top-down way throughout the whole country. We can debate that, but they are taken out. So the top result is that on a scale of minus 100 to plus 100, Britain on average has returned a score of plus 26. So that means people feel that the provision of the things that they think is important in their local area is somewhere between neither good and bad and good. So plus 50 would be good. It's somewhere in between there and neutral. But what was particularly interesting that we found, or surprised us perhaps, is that the results of people in suburbs grouped together, regardless of whether they were city or town suburbs, and the results of people in urban centres grouped together, regardless of whether they were city or town urban centres. And urban centres generally performed better. People like living in the centre, and there's lots of things available, so that makes sense. But our recommendation, therefore, is that the policy focus needs to adapt itself accordingly, and that there should be a strong sense of what should be provided to people living in suburban communities. 57% of the population lives in suburbs. Second result that surprised us was that people's sense of place is very strongly linked to how they perceive the quality of local shops. So the retail offer is really important, as you can see from the chart. When asked which is the most important thing to have in local areas, although there was a wide spread, shops came top, closely followed by access to fresh air and nature. And separately, if you ask people what's the most urgent thing that needs improving, it comes back to shops and the retail offer as well. We think this is important, and that therefore in the ongoing conversations about business rates reform, local councils should be given the maximum flexibility to use the business rates tool to align the local retail experience with what residents demonstrably are saying that they want. Third insight is that a quarter of the population feels negative about place on our index. That means they think that the provision of things that are important to them are nearer bad than good. Bear in mind the national average is plus 26. And we separated out that group of people and had a look at what they were saying about other things. And we found that it was very strongly linked to how they see transport services in their area, and to a lesser extent, housing. And so there's clearly something about feeling that your local community is not providing what you want, and your physical mobility as well. So this supports a recommendation for more investment in public transport, which we already know is important. But we think there's also an insight here about people who don't have incomes, who are looking for work, because if you're feeling negative about your place, and you think there's a problem with public transport, and you don't have an income, then it's pretty hard to see a way out of that. So we recommend automatic free travel on public transport for people who are job seekers as a way to improve that mobility and counteract the sense of being stuck. When we start to map it by constituency, we see that the proportion of population feeling negative about their place is particularly high along the east coast of England. That's the darker red in the map, and also to a certain extent in the southwest of England and southwest of Wales. We simply note this and say it's important, and think it should be relevant to the levelling up debate, and we'll be interested to see whether this is surprising to panellists or other people on this call. Finally, turning to the results relating to the pandemic, our main recommendation is to embrace flexible working by location where people want to do it, explicitly as a regeneration tool, as well as the other issues that are being considered by business and individuals. We found a very strong connection between the proportion of the population who had worked from home and wanted to continue doing so, and the proportion of the population who said they fully planned to spend more money locally after the pandemic than they had previously. As you can see from this chart, this declines as you get into more rural areas, but the point is that it's positive everywhere. There's a stronger result in urban centres simply because there's more white collar workers, more people were required to work from home in those areas. So don't encourage people to go back into the centres. There's plenty of activity in the centre already. Do embrace flexible working as a levelling up tool. And finally, just for information, we also saw from our research that people who were forced to move home in the early stages of the pandemic were a demographic that perhaps weren't coming out in the media. A typical person who was required to move because of the pandemic, so they were displaced in a sense, would be in their mid-20s on a low income. I checked to see whether these were university people kind of going home. There may be a bit of that in the under 21s, but predominantly these are people in work on low incomes, quite likely to have already started families. communities and are disproportionately likely to be of non-white ethnicity compared to the areas in which they live. And they are moving within urban areas, not doing a flight to the countryside, although there may be a bit of that on the higher incomes. So there was a very vulnerable cohort who had their place quite seriously affected at the beginning. And finally, by way of conclusion, you would expect us to recommend this, but we feel that this type of subjective data-driven index adds something to the established metrics that are used, be they about deprivation or strength of sort of social cohesion that are out there in the Westminster policy debate. So unsurprisingly, we recommend that this approach be continued. Thanks, Polly.
Thank you so much, Kitty. I'm now going to hand over to Robert Jenrick, the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, who can tell us about how you respond to the research, but also what the government's agenda is on this levelling up agenda and how it all fits together.
Great, thanks, Polly, and thank you very much to everyone at Demos for inviting me today, and Kitty for the hard work and very interesting research that you've done, and to Nigel and all at Legal & General for making this possible. I should say that Legal & General is an important business because it's actually one of the few investors in towns and cities outside of London in this country, and ensuring that more institutional investors follow suit will be an important theme for the country in the years ahead, and we as a government want to encourage others to follow suit. I thought, reading the research and hearing Kitty's presentation, that there was a lot of commonality across the political spectrum now in this country. The overarching thesis is that place, identity, and civic pride matter. They probably never mattered so much, and that all political parties are now seeking ways in which to reinvigorate and renew towns and cities across the country, and looking beyond London and the southeast to do so. I think we have taken some of those places for granted, and we've undervalued and underinvested in them for too long. Government, I think, now needs to focus in many different ways, and this is a multifaceted problem, on renewing pride in communities, and doing so in order to prevent the brain drain from those places, so that everybody feels that they can make a successful life in the community in which they grow up, that everyone feels that there is optimism and enthusiasm and a future for the place in which they call home, and have that sense of emotional connection and identity, and that we do breathe life into all of those urban centres, not just our great cities. And it is not about levelling down London or Manchester or Birmingham. I fundamentally believe that those places will prosper again, however challenged they are at the moment as a result of COVID, as a result of the lack of students, of international tourists, of office workers. They will bounce back because the fundamentals of them is very strong. But we also need now to be focusing in on smaller cities and on towns across the country. And that is what my department and the government is trying to do in many different ways. I should say that, with some exceptions, the forces that we're talking about today have not been created by COVID. In some respects, COVID has changed nothing. COVID has magnified and accelerated market forces and social forces that have long predated it. But there are some exceptions to that. And one is the point that Kitty made at the end of her presentation, that COVID may present us with a generational opportunity through a more flexible working environment to lead hybrid lives where you can work in London some days a week, work in Newark in my constituency, only an hour and 20 minutes up the East Coast main line. And by doing that, breathe new life into communities and create new possibilities for parts of the country that simply wouldn't have existed a year or two ago and might have taken many, many more years to become a reality. And I agree that we should try now to make that possible as far as government can do by encouraging employers to embrace that as a source of levelling up and regeneration. But returning to the wider point, what we need now is an intentional programme to reinvigorate people's pride in their communities and to raise up character and identity and optimism of people in those places. And I think that is what the government is doing, and we want to do more in the months and years ahead. The Prime Minister will be speaking more about this shortly on levelling up generally, and Neil O'Brien and others within government who are working with me to take this agenda forward will be as well. But let me give you a few examples of the things that we're doing, which I think chime with the research that Demos has presented today. Firstly, that emphasis on smaller cities and town centres. We have now to focus investment on those places because they will struggle to attract the private sector investment of the kind that Legal & General and others do in some of the bigger cities. In a small way, we've made progress in this department by announcing that we're going to be moving a very substantial part of the department to Wolverhampton. And we chose Wolverhampton rather than Birmingham or Manchester or Leeds, great cities though they are, because I think we need to have a concerted effort to back those smaller cities where the impact of government will be greatest. In towns, we're working through the myriad of funds that we have today, the Levelling Up Fund, the Towns Fund, the High Streets Fund, to bring collectively very large sums of money for regeneration to bear on those places. Between 5 to 10 billion pounds will be invested in this Parliament in those places. And there's a lively debate about where we should invest in, but we are already at the point where government is investing in a quarter of the towns of England. And I think by the end of the summer, that will have increased to a third of the towns of England. So a very significant number of places we're now actively intervening in to support infrastructure, technology, skills, and cultural investments, all the kinds of things that together create that sense of pride, of optimism, and encourage the private sector to get involved as well. On the high street, the challenges are very significant, as we all know, and it is interesting to see the research that Kitty presented, that people go back to time and again. We want to see some good shops in our neighbourhood. That's a difficult one for us to tackle, but what can we in government do beyond the issues that are really lie with the Chancellor on business rates and taxation? Well, one thing we have tried to do is create one of the world's most flexible regimes so that you can turn that coffee shop into a hairdresser's, into a yoga studio. And if that shop ultimately lies empty or derelict and there is no future for it in the medium term, turn it into good quality housing. And that is something that we've managed to bring forward during the pandemic and through our planning reforms. I hope there'll be more things we can do there to create a very flexible regime. Because one of the good things, I think, to say is that the bones of many of the towns and small cities we're talking about are very strong. During the local election campaign, I've been in Accrington and Bolton and Bury and Hartlepool. And actually, although some of these places have challenges, undoubtedly, the architectural heritage is strong, the sense of pride is there. You know, you walk around brilliant Victorian and Edwardian civic architecture. There is something there that we can definitely build upon, even in the towns that have got the greatest challenges. Secondly, the Levelling Up Fund that we've brought forward has a very strong transport focus to it. And there's been a debate about that, I know, in the media, but I think it's the right thing to do, to focus on those places that have had the least transport investment in recent years, those places where it's hardest for people on lower incomes to get into the opportunity centres, to find good quality work, to go to colleges, to go to universities, to access public services. And that's what that fund is seeking to do, amongst other things. And of course, the government has other levers as well, like buses, which we're trying to have a renewed focus on as well in that regard. But I think that's extremely important, to look at the places where it's hardest to get into the cities and the opportunity areas, as well as trying to bring some of those public services back to towns. And one thing that I've agreed across government is a presumption in favour of town centres, so that if the government is investing in somewhere, whether that's a new FE college, a GP surgery, it should be in the town centre, not as we've done in recent years, building them on business parks or out of town. Bring everything we can into town and city centres as far as we in government have levers over that. Thirdly, we are making a concerted push on housing and home ownership of all kinds. We're taking forward now a planning reform bill that was announced in the Queen's speech, and this will hopefully make it easier for people, particularly smaller developers and builders and local entrepreneurs, to get building, create jobs, create economic activity in all parts of the country. And part of that is breaking the stranglehold of big volume house builders. Part of it is trying to encourage more development to happen outside of London and the Southeast, in those places where viability today is most challenged. And I think that will prove to be one of the most important supply side reforms this Parliament sees if we get it right. And I know there will again be a lively debate on how we do that, but I want to work cross-party as far as we can to achieve that. So in closing, I think the golden thread, which we're all looking for here, is how do you make people as proud as possible in the place in which they live or they grew up? And how can we have an intentional campaign across government, central and local, to achieve that through greater investment, through stimulating private sector investment of all kinds, from the small builder up to the big players like legal in general, and create aspiration, optimism, and a sense of ownership in their communities. And I'm very grateful for the good quality research that Demos has presented today, and look forward to working with you, Polly and Kitty, in the future to achieve it.
Thank you so much, Robert. Unfortunately, the Secretary of State has to leave us for some urgent government business, which is probably a good thing, because doing government business is generally something to keep on top of. We will follow up with a note about the discussions that we have with the panel and with the audience. But thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks.
If you do have questions, do please start to post them in the Q&A section, where we will be able to respond to them shortly. I've got 2 responses to the research and also the government agenda that Robert Jenrick has outlined for us. The first person I'd like to ask to respond is Tara Alice, who is the Director of Research and Economics at McKinsey.
Thank you very much, Polly, and thank you, Kitty, and to the Secretary of State as well for a very useful background for this discussion. I'm going to remark on 3 things, really. One, something that's not in the report, which is also important in this levelling up debate. Second, some of the key things in the report and in the research that I think are worthy of highlighting and taking forward very much in the future. And then thirdly, what I see as the kind of big implications of some of the findings, primarily for kind of policymaking and thinking about the future of places. So Kitty has been very clear that there were intentionally some things that were left out of the scope for this research, and that's necessary for getting somewhere and getting some results. But if we start with the idea that what we really want to maximize in the country is people's satisfaction with their lives, then there are 2 things that are really critical to that are obviously and intentionally not in scope for this particular piece of work, but we need to keep in mind. First of all, the number 1 thing that people, that determines that we can kind of empirically find has a connection with people's satisfaction with their lives is health, and especially mental health. And I know Demos is planning to do some more work on public services and generally kind of health-related issues. And I think that will remain critical. And it's not just for governments to provide either. Businesses have a huge role to play in ensuring that people's health is as good as it could be. The second thing that people obviously care about is jobs and incomes. And with 14% of people still on furlough, so that's about 4 million people, and with claimant counts still kind of increasing, we're in a situation where probably that particular thing is heightened in people's minds. And so in addition to looking at what people need in their local areas, obviously there will need to be a consideration of what businesses need in order to kind of survive and thrive and create those jobs going forward. So those are things that are not in scope today, but we need to keep in mind and are important. What is in scope is also incredibly important. And there are 3 particular things that delight me about this research, which, as a bit of a data geek in particular, I think has been done in a way that really gives us some real insight into actionable things that could be done on the ground. So the first one is just the breadth of the questions that has been asked. Really important not just to focus on one thing, like, do we need high-speed broadband, but what are all the different things that people need in their lives in order to have a good life and to enjoy where they're living. And in particular, while jobs and health are important, social connections are also incredibly important. And what this research gets us is that importance of social capital. And I hope that it continues to be a basis on which people can have very data-driven and evidence-based discussions around social capital. The second thing is the subjective nature of it. I think people answering questionnaires and surveys know better than people in Whitehall or in Westminster what they actually want and need. And it is up to those people in Whitehall or Westminster and also in the business community to listen. They can't all go and talk to the 65 million people in the country, but they can try and look at the 20,000 responses that Kitty's got here and many other surveys. And I think that is incredibly important, not to draw conclusions from what works for you, but what actually people are saying will work for them. And the granularity is a final thing that is incredibly important. So I think this analysis has been done on even more than parliamentary constituency level originally. Obviously, there are limitations to what you can publish. But we all know that while the levelling up agenda is important, there's differences between cities and towns. The real differences are inside cities and towns. And the differences in life satisfaction as well as incomes and jobs are bigger inside regions than they are between regions. And so that granularity really does need to bear on future policy making. So let me then come to the conclusions or the sort of implications of this. The first one is around this importance of social capital that we don't forget about as we talk about levelling up. It's easy to fixate on infrastructure and physical capital, but actually human capital in the sense of skills and health and social capital, they're critical not just for economic growth, but also for people's well-being. So those must be an equal partner in those discussions. And I guess the second one is around citizen engagement. When we've looked across the world for kind of best practice studies around places that have managed to level up or places that have managed to deliver transformations, an element of citizen engagement has been critical to all of those. And so I hope that this again lays some ground for a better citizen engagement going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We totally agree with that and would love to be able to follow up this work in areas to enable that citizen engagement, because it's one thing to model out what places are broadly like, but quite another thing to really engage that local population in ideation about the future. Our final speaker is Dr. Nigel Wilson, Chief Exec at Legal and General, and also a member of the Prime Minister and Chancellor's Build Back Better Business Council, which is a mouthful to say. Nigel.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Polly, Tara, and Kitty, for the outstanding work that's been done on this project. And it's great to have engagement on this. Our insight many years ago was that the UK is kind of a low investment, low growth, low productivity, low wage economy right now, if we're honest about it. And that's because of 30 or 40 years underinvestment on a huge scale. And we're very much strong believers that we need an investment-led recovery. The world's awash with money. The UK is a great place to invest. We should be investing it. And as the Minister said, we've invested about 30 billion outside of London in the different towns and cities across the UK, and we've certainly got at least another 30 billion that we can invest. We have greater than 10 billion projects currently across the UK. And our insight was simple, was that for the UK to grow, other towns and cities needed to be invested in, and not just London. And that there was huge potential to invest in those cities, whether it's Glasgow, Edinburgh, Newcastle, Leeds, Sunderland, Sheffield, Cardiff, Bristol, Bath, Oxford, Cambridge, Belfast. Everywhere we went, we just saw opportunities. Our concerns are really the following: is that the pandemic was really an attrition of the susceptible. And it's been very unfair. It's been very unfair in the way that it's hit all people in particular. And our central case is that we'll have a K-shaped recovery in which the well-off and people with good jobs will continue to do well. And they've actually got a very large amount of savings now because they haven't spent their money, and other people haven't done so well off. And so again, we'll have the attrition of the susceptible, which is those who are already not doing so well or continue to not do so well, and those who are already doing well will do a little bit better as in investment happens in the economy. And we can't make that happen. And it was great to see from the analysis that coastal towns featured, because that's a real problem area right across the UK. And there's definitely an authenticity in the report by highlighting that on the East Coast and in the Southwest. And we originally had a meeting in the House of Commons a couple of years ago with, we asked 4 MPs to come and discuss coastal town issues with us. 25 turned up, 21 were slightly uninvited. We had to expect, and it was like the 4 Yorkshiremen of yesteryear as we went through the problems that each of these places have. And the solutions are all investment-led. And, we're getting a roadmap now. We agree with all of the recommendations. You need lots of input at a local level to try and solve local issues. And it can be done. We built the UK's largest surveying business based in Barnsley. Our lifetime mortgage business is based in Solihull. We're building a world-class workplace savings business out of Cardiff. And we're just about to invest in a huge new office complex for those people, environmentally friendly office complex, as part of our massive regeneration of Cardiff that we've been involved in. And we're really up for this because the UK is very lucky. It's got great universities everywhere. There's an enormous amount of innovation going on, huge amount of startups going on. And those startups don't need to be located in the big cities anymore. And that's really one of the undercurrents that comes off this report, is there's a great deal of flexibility. And we need to create that flexibility in how we invest in the economy so that people could live in Newark if they wanted to, or Stevenage, which is a very unusual town, is that their facilities have dropped down so much because everybody commutes from Stevenage into London. And how we repurpose places like that is really central to what we want to do. Housing, we own 5 house builders, as people probably don't know. We're certainly one of the biggest house builders in Britain. But housing's been neglected for 40 years, since 1980, in the housing bill in 1980 versus 2020. And we made a massive amount of environmentally friendly housing built in Britain. And the money is there. The world is simply awash with money. And it isn't just legal and general. We look after 1.3 trillion pounds of money right now. And so what you can do with a few billion is it makes a huge difference. And we've got friends of friends. We look after money for 3,200 pension funds and sovereign wealth funds. And they want to do good things from a societal point of view, because there's lots we need to fix. And so it's a time for action, and it's a time, in a certain sense, to stop pledging, to stop talking about stuff, is to have investment based on good research, and this is good research, and that we, for one, will be continuing to step up and really try and make a difference across the UK, because levelling up has to deliver. And as I said earlier, we are worried that we'll have a K-shaped recovery and that we won't level up, and that things happen too slowly. And we'd love it if the Treasury moved ahead with their project in Darlington and their projects in Leeds, and the Minister talked about Wolverhampton. But you've got to get on with it so people will see that actually the jobs are coming, the buildings are being put there, that places are being made which are developed, which are relevant to the people who live there. So that's all I was going to say by way of introduction. Thank you.
That's fantastic, Nigel. Thank you very much. So there's quite a number of questions in the Q&A. Please do continue to add your questions. There's also, you can respond to other people's questions, help to kind of tease out what it is that you're wanting to ask. And you can also upvote other people's questions. And the more you upvote them, the more I am likely to bring them in. So the first question that's at the top of the list at the moment is about London suburbs. But, I think, Kitty, you might have thoughts about wider suburbs as well, and whether because of rent controls, because of, limits to housing allowances, for example, we're seeing a flow of people, very poor people, often out of city centres, and whether there are risks there for suburban development.
Yes, really good question. And I think our research really shone a spotlight on the difference between urban centres and suburbs, wherever they are. So for London suburbs, therefore, I hope our research will make the point that's implicit in the question, which is just because it's London doesn't necessarily mean it scores very highly. And one thing I was particularly surprised by, and obviously we only looked at place-based things, so not income specifically or community, only slightly looked at community, was that people in the suburbs particularly valued fresh air and nature and parks, for example, but scored them worse than in an urban centre, which is a bit counterintuitive in a way, because you'd think a more built up area would perhaps have less green spaces. But of course, as soon as you address the question head on, it makes perfect sense, because the radial nature of suburbs can often mean you have more sort of geographic areas that don't have any invested in parks. You just have rows of houses. And so the parks are actually better in the town centres. Now, parks might sound not very sort of policy kind of national kind of fashionable thing to talk about, but what's coming out of this very clearly is that for quality of life in the suburbs, they're hugely important. And that's why one of our recommendations is that we get a clearer sense of what a kind of decent place-based kind of quality of life should be in the suburbs, regardless of whether they're in the north or the south of England, so equally applying to London, so that we know when local councils are succeeding and what good looks like, and what you should expect from suburban life generally. And I think it's particularly more important when those people who have previous office-based jobs now have more choices about where they locate. And we've picked up the idea of the 15-minute community, i.e. you should be able to do all the necessities of everyday life within a 15-minute sort of cycle or walk area, regardless of where you live. And I think that's particularly relevant to the future of suburbs. So I want to see more policy focus on suburbs, please.
I grew up on a hill where there was nothing but sheep for 15 minutes on a bicycle, but you can't satisfy everybody. Nigel, do you have thoughts about suburban investment and development? And then I'll come to Tara.
No, absolutely. And, we think, we have this theory, in the line we use, some of our towns and cities are not overbuilt, they're under demolished. And, there are things that we need to knock down and rebuild. And that they're always quite friction heavy, when we're in discussions around stuff. But I look at our development in Walthamstow, which is a circa 600 rented accommodation. The defining goal for that was that nurses could live together and afford to live together in Walthamstow in a 2 or 3 bedroom apartment and commute into London. And it would be totally economic to do this. This wasn't sort of rich people moving out a little bit. This is designed for the community there. It's right near, the tube station. It's near the reservoirs, stunning views of the reservoirs and whatever. And we think that there's huge opportunities to do more of this type of, regeneration right across the suburbs, not just in London. We're looking at Macclesfield outside of Manchester, which is another, huge opportunity there for a big mixed-use development with houses and lots of jobs and all the things that you were talking about. In general, the London suburbs are quite difficult to deal with as councils, and there's a lot of friction within them. And so we find getting the changes required is probably the slowest in and around London. Hence, but as far back as I can remember, London's had a housing target of 50,000 houses a year and has never achieved it. Well, if I had targets which I've never achieved for 20 years, I wouldn't have a job for very long. And I think that's something that we really need to get to address that, because we've certainly found the towns and cities outside of London much easier to deal with. And London is great in the city, and there's amazing big buildings that have been put up, but that's not solving, the problems that we're talking about today. And therefore, I found it terrific working in partnership with people in Newcastle and Sunderland and Sheffield and Cardiff and Bristol. And we're super excited about the level of interaction we have and the problem solving that we have everywhere. London's is the most difficult.
Tara, your thoughts on these changing demographics of suburban areas?
Yes, I mean, building on what Nigel was saying earlier about this kind of divergence and how COVID has created a situation in which the best of people are now even better off and the worst of people are even worse off, I suspect. You know, this will continue, and London is a really important example of that. So London as a whole has seen an incredible hit from COVID, partly because of the type of economy it is. But if you look inside London, it is very much the deprived areas where this has happened. I think realistically, some of the sort of thinking needs to now be ground up in those areas rather than top down from kind of the center of the city. And what that might mean for some regions is that they are, they do turn into places where, you know, at least the local amenities and the local public services can be good, even if there are not that many jobs and people have to commute for those jobs, if that makes sense. Because it's not obvious to me that you can create sort of vibrant hubs everywhere. So, you know, it's almost like horses for courses. You need to look at the local strengths and the local weaknesses and build up from that kind of granular picture. I would then just echo Kitty's point, just as an anecdotal piece, but it's actually based on some real interesting research as well. These green spaces, they've done some super granular research in Germany, which shows that if you live more than 300 yards from a park, it doesn't have a positive impact on your well-being. But if you live in that kind of circle that's quite close to where your home is, it makes a big positive difference. And the reason why this might be even more important going forward is this kind of trend of nesting, people staying home more, will be another divergence. Some people will stay home a lot more than they used to. Some people will, you know, go out a lot more than they used to because they want to get out of kind of whole COVID mindset. But if people are spending more time at home, then, you know, obviously making the local place something that's positive for them is even more important.
Great, thank you. The next question I want to ask is about revealed preferences. And I think this is going to be really important when it comes to shops in particular. The question was, basically, are people just sort of lying to us, saying, I really want local shops, but refusing to shop in them because actually they're shopping in supermarkets and shopping online? Do we need to change people's behavior? Is it that, are people just wrong? Or is it that there's a kind of another solution here? Tara, I wanted to come to you first on that one.
It's a really excellent question. I think the answer kind of goes a little bit both ways. So yes, of course, when you ask people what they want, it's not ever the same as what they actually reveal through their behaviors. But at the same time, I've been thinking more recently that the shops obviously provide more value than just you being able to pick up your pint of milk, or, you know, in my case, Diet Coke or whatever it is, from your local shop. There's that, you know, it's this social capital. It's the fact that you might bump into some of your neighbors. It's the chat you have with the, you know, person you've got to recognize, you know, it's the walk that you take there that gives you a bit of exercise during the day. It's, you know, all of these other kind of social values, which obviously by definition from an economic point of view do not get kind of factored into the prices and the values that people exchange when they go and buy that pint of milk. And so I think there's a bigger role than perhaps economists have historically considered for government, whether it's local government or central government, to think about shops and retail areas and high streets as basically public goods. So going beyond that kind of wall of the shop, to think that inside that commercial property, actually there's also a lot of value that no one's going to pay for individually, but collectively, actually, they probably would want to pay for it and would want to have it there.
And Nigel, what does that look like from an investor perspective? You know, the Secretary of State talked about business rates. He talked about civic architecture as well. Like, who are we going to pay for on the high street to get the footfall? Because it used to be Debenhams, and that's not really an option anymore.
It's not really an option anymore. I've not given up, because I think if you go to Tokyo, which I don't know how many people have been there, they've created a huge amount of green spaces now in Tokyo. And if you go in the suburbs of Tokyo, they've restructured their shopping. So it's very local, it's very friendly. You'll get, you know, the dentist, the doctors, there's lots of different types of shops which exist. And it isn't shops, Debenhams, it's much more experience driven, whether that's a health experience or a yoga studio. So the nature of how we spend our money is very different. And, you know, I live in central London. I rent a flat in central London. I walk to work because I happen to, that's a lifestyle choice. But I shop locally. And I think as we work from home more, we will definitely shop locally. And that came out in your study. And it's something we believe in. We're massive believers in the local multiplier. That money then gets spent, and then innovation comes, because startups are exploding in Britain. And we've got to figure out how we can scale those up. And those can be in local areas, much more than having to have a concentration in London, which is what we've seen for the last 20 or 30 years, particularly in financial services area. And there are so many second chances that we're having as an economy, whether that's in life sciences, whether it's in shopping or lifestyle choices that we're making, it's in electric vehicles. These are going to create so many different types of new industries, and they can be local, and the facilities can be local, and we can localize in a much more productive way and choose better lifestyle choices for people. And so if we can get this wave of investment, productive investment going across the country, we can really, really, really move the whole economy forward. Just going back again to one of the central points, if we don't do this, we'll just see an acceleration of inequality and all the things, you know, the care recovery, et cetera, that we've seen. It's a trend that got accelerated in the pandemic. And unfortunately, it's the wrong trend. And we have to reverse that trend and do lots of things. Training can be much more localized than actually everybody shopping and staying in a hotel in London and which is the way we've seen things in the past. And that flexibility in the workplace is going to create huge opportunities for localism.
And Kitty, do you have, you know, thoughts other than the ones you've mentioned already about keeping activity on those high streets or boosting new kinds of activity?
Yeah, just on the revealed preferences point very quickly, we designed the survey as much as we could to try and force real choices so that they were, you know, the revealed preferences were revealed. And I should say that supermarkets was included in local shops and scored very, very highly. And there was another sort of sense that came out that everybody, and this was a couple of months ago, but even then everybody was sort of ready to go out and spend more everywhere, and that included online. And I think that sort of shows where we are in the pandemic, that we're actually kind of itching to get out there again. So I'm actually a little bit more optimistic, I think, perhaps about the effect on the high street. I think there's a real opportunity to sort of galvanise that sort of increased importance of local place, which came out very strongly in our report. And particularly if people are working locally a little more. There's been some academic research, a paper called Zoom Shock that showed while there is a bit of a dislocation, that a lot of the service sector workers that previously commuted into the city centre should be able to find work locally as well, which I think is very encouraging in lots of ways. So I'm relatively optimistic.
Great. So the next question I wanted to ask is around the relationship with local government. The questioner has particularly focused on social housing, but I think it goes more broadly. I was sort of sad not to be able to explore this with the Secretary of State, but, you know, he's talking about we're going to be investing in a third of towns, but it's also true that, I mean, central government invests via revenue support grant to all of the councils and the business rate, you know, so is this kind of funding, which is there's a big pot which government seeks applications into, and then central government hands out the funding for whatever Barnsley's high street regeneration. Is that the way forward? Should there be more devolution instead? Should we simply be funding local government, whether it's on housing or high streets? Nigel, you know, you've talked quite candidly about your relationship with some of the councils. Which do you think more devolution's important, or should I just not worry about it?
We are strong believers in democracy, and devolution is part of that, and we want people to feel empowered around these things. But we, you know, in big picture terms, you know, my generation has been very selfish. You know, we got free education. You know, we had massive increases in housing. We got DB pension schemes, and we've taken all that away from young people. And so that education is very expensive. Housing is really, really expensive. And DB pension schemes have long since gone. And we need to be giving back and giving back in solving these societal problems. We've got a affordable housing program of about 6,000 houses already from a standing start 2 years ago, and we're finding that people want to do business with firms like Legal and General, so we're very encouraged right across the country around that as an issue. And we think there's huge opportunities for much more to be done, and the government's been better at this. I mean, under previous chancellors and whatever, there was definitely a feeling that the only way to win votes was encourage, help to buy, and help to buy, drove all sorts of outcomes. But we have to build housing of all types, build to rent, later life living, affordable, modular housing, as well as build to sell housing across the UK. And we're getting a fair crack at the whip at that. And, if I look at, say a scheme that we have in Horsham, there's a good mix between those. Another Crowthorne again, these are 2,000 and 3,000 unit, £1 billion kind of pounds investments, when there's a school there and there's a community centre there and there's going to be shops there. And so obviously affordable housing doesn't look that different from any other housing. It's just integrated. And one of the thrills during lockdown was I was at one of our sites and a family drove up to what is a stunning development. And there's affordable housing included in that, right? And it looks fantastic. And the family got out of the car and the little kids were punching the air with excitement about this amazing house. They're racing in and out of it. And it was just wonderful to see physically, in the midst of all the crisis that was going on, these houses are still being built, lives were being transformed by housing and jobs and a place. And it's got green space near it, it's fairly near shops, and it's got that 15-minute rule that we talked about all applying. So there's lots of good people out there who really want to deliver good outcomes. And I'm urging my generation to be kinder to the future generations, because we obviously, my children, my 5 beautiful daughters, you can see photos behind me, and my grandchildren, whatever, you want them to have great lives. And we've got to lay the foundations for that right now, rather than be, the proverbial NIMBYists, when we've drawn up the drawbridge so that great things that we got, we're not giving to anybody else. And this wonderful amount of money that's out there, which is very cheap, cheapest it's ever been in history, gets used to really deliver great outcomes for people.
Thank you. Inspirational. Tara, thoughts on devolution and social housing?
Yes, so just building briefly on what Nigel's just been saying, I do hope that there are some solutions for spending all that money and investment in some of these softer areas too, skills and human capital, and this social capital. I know they don't sort of traditionally deliver the sort of cash returns, but they deliver an enormous return, both in terms of equality of opportunity and kind of life satisfaction and economy at the kind of aggregate level in the long term. So I think it's very much a job for government and businesses to figure out what are the business models that will allow us to invest in those things as well, because they are hugely important in all of this. In terms of the kind of devolution agenda, I anecdotally would just recount that when we have looked at for kind of these best practice examples of places that have transformed themselves, they have tended to be places where they did have quite a lot of the levers available to them at that local level. And why is that? Well, first of all, I think Nigel was kind of alluding to it. You get accountability, as a council. If you do the wrong things and you spend the money in the wrong places, then you might not get re-elected. And it's a more kind of immediate sort of accountability than you get easily at the national level. And the second thing, though, is that in all of those kind of case studies, what you found was, what would be the word, like ultra focus on across silo thinking and working. And I don't know much about local authorities here in the UK, but I do hear that they tend to be a little bit siloed. But if you want to regenerate a place, you actually need to have everybody from the planning, from transport, from environmental, from waste collection, from schools, from hospitals, from GP surgeries, everything coming together and looking at it really very much from the citizen's perspective, not from the perspective of what are the business lines of the local authority that all need to kind of get their operations running. that's a kind of 180-degree change to, I think, the way that policy is being made at the moment. And so if you devolve without that capability or the seeds of that capability, then I don't know that you would necessarily get a brilliant outcome. So the devolution needs to go alongside with capability. That's kind of my observation.
Kitty, any brief thoughts on devolution? I want to ask one more question before we get to the end in 5 minutes.
Yeah, I think I agree with Tara about having levers. And so I'd be interested in policies that sort of aligned incentives between local authorities and what we're trying to do nationally. The thing that I would chuck into the mix is, perhaps I would say this, but having a sort of more systematic way of gathering the views of local residents and holding councils to account in delivering them, that's beyond simply who do you vote for in a low turnout election. So perhaps using revealed preference polling.
Yes, or even Demos's new experimental voting, community voting tool called Combined Choice, which you can also read about on our website. So there's 2 more questions I want to go around. One is vitally important and the other one slightly frivolous, but just I was really struck by it, from Phoebe. So the one from Phoebe is thinking about the place that you grew up. What's the one thing you think that place needs that would transform it? And for me, again, on a hill, the answer is a bus. And the other question is actually much more important, about climate change. And how do we make sure that all of this regeneration, including Nigel's proposals to knock a bunch of stuff down, can have a positive contribution to our path to net zero? And feel free to answer those 2 questions in whichever order you prefer. Kitty, I cut you short on devolution. Why don't you go first?
I spent my teenage years in Hammersmith, which probably I think scored very highly in terms of our index. We had lots of buses. So the answer is probably linked to the second question. It was probably around air quality, I suspect. We're on a one-way street going onto a dual carriageway, and I do remember a lot of pollution. Whereas that might not be directly climate change, I think air quality would have been is the issue most of relevance to communities like that.
Tara, thoughts?
So I grew up in Finland, in a smallish town.
And it was perfect,
there is nothing at all. It was pretty perfect. I cannot think of anything that I would change. However, I now live in Battersea, and the thing that I would definitely change here is noise. And I think that absolutely links to the climate change agenda. So just like electric vehicles are going to help with the noise, better buildings and housing stock will help with the noise, and they will both also help with climate change. And so I think government now needs to put its 10-point action points into like real practical deliverables, whether that's around subsidies, whether that's around regulation, whether it's whatever. I think that whole agenda can accelerate, and it doesn't have to cost a ton if there's a lot of innovation that goes into it as well. And I think the government just needs to be really bold about that, and the private sector will deliver. If you say as of tomorrow, we're only going to accept zero carbon housing, loads of people are going to scream, but in a year's time, they'll start delivering zero carbon housing.
Nigel, final words to you.
I grew up in a 2-bedroom council house, and I was very lucky because I had social mobility. I had brilliant teachers, and the person who lives in that council house today has a 0 chance of getting a scholarship to MIT, getting a PhD from MIT, having a tremendous business career, which ends up as chief executive of a wonderful organization like Legal & General. And I take my children to see it. And when we go up north and say, this is where I grew up. But I had the opportunity to become what I am today. There's no chance of that. That's why I'm such a strong believer in levelling up. And we're going to make such a big effort to try and get levelling up. And part of that means a levelling up of opportunities for people. And I was taught you can be whatever you want to be. And I had great mentors and coaches all my life who really made a difference to me. And I'm thankful for that. And that so many people don't have that opportunity anymore, because we've done the opposite of levelling up over the last 30 or 40 years. We do have a risk of a K-shaped recovery, and that's not going to be great.
Thank you. I think really important words for us to end on. So thank you so much to Nigel and to everybody at Legal & General who made this research possible. Thank you to Kitty for doing it, and to Tara for all of your really helpful reflections and challenges on all of the endless research questions that could go on from this. I've seen so many in the Q&A. And it's the challenge of running a research organisation is you always end every project with at least 12 ideas for what you could do next. If you're interested in working with Demos, sponsoring our research or engaging with us in the future, finding out more about what we do, please do feel free to drop me a line. You can find my email address, drop me a line on Twitter. And thank you everybody for participating. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions, but I was really grateful to learn that I really wish I'd grown up in Finland. So thank you everybody.